timing actually does matter, right? But not to the point where you should become consumed with it. You're not looking to win at those things, but you're looking to win at life. Because somebody can get their blood work done, all of a sudden everybody's an expert in how to interpret biomarkers, most of them with no endocrine background. And it scares the crap out of me because you want to talk about context and nuance.
So in this episode, I interviewed Professor Shawn Arent. The topic we got into was nutrient timing, to be differentiated from nutrition periodization, the strategic use of protein, carbohydrates, and other nutritional substances.
Eat enough, get your protein, sleep, hydrate, lift heavy stuff, run. You can do these things like way ahead of the curve already. The very little it actually costs you to pay attention to the timing helps you get that much more out of the efforts you're investing in your training, the money you're spending on your food, the time you're putting into trying to take care of yourself. Why not maximize that ROI? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. When we look at it, can you wait to eat? Sure, you can, but should you?
I think I'm going to make that a clip, and that's just going to be the whole podcast.
That's all
the
it
answer
is, right?
was, so welcome, Shawn Arent, Professor Shawn Arent. Oh my God, I can't believe we're talking again. It's been years, mate.
Way too long.
Well, I think I've just made it clear that we know each other. It's been many years. Years. In fact, I don't have a beard. I think when I first met you, I had a beard. I can't do a beard now because it's just gray.
Too gray, yeah. Life will catch up with you on that one, I know.
But a lot's happened in the world. And for us, we were just talking offline, some crazy things, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. What I wanted to talk about is a topic that I know you're passionate about. And it's a topic that we have spoken about before in another podcast. Right. But this is something that I really wanted to focus on in Fueling Greatness, this new-ish now podcast that I desperately wanted to have you part of. So thank you.
And I appreciate it. That means a lot to me. It really does. It's I'm excited that you're doing this, but yeah, when you reached out, it was a no-brainer. I just enjoy when we get to talk.
Good man. Well, okay. So I'm just going to tease people and just let them know we're going to get into nutrient timing, strategic use of maybe certain foods, macronutrients, etc., and how that may or may not be important for performance and recovery. But before we get into that, let's have you give us a bit of an overview as to who you are and why I should be talking to you about this stuff.
Honestly, I have no idea why you're talking to me about this stuff.
Yeah, he's just a blagger. He's a total blagger. What he says, we just met at a pub, had a pint and a packet of crisps, and we thought, sod it, let's talk about nutrient timing.
You're like, let's talk about Guinness timing. This is great. I'm Guinness timing. Nutrient timing,
yes.
Crap. Okay. Yeah. So, no, I appreciate that. And honestly, so I'm the department chair and a professor at the University of South Carolina in the United States. And we are one of the top 3 sports science programs in the U.S. And one of the top globally as well. We have also one of the top ranked PhD programs in the National Academy of Kinesiology from over here. But anyway, I got here in 2019. Before that, I was at Rutgers University in New Jersey for 17 years. I was director of the Center for Health and Human Performance there. And now that I've been at South Carolina, I've worked in pro sports, I've worked in college sports. And obviously for a lot of your listeners, if you're not familiar with the U.S. sports system, college sports are a big deal, and especially the conference we're in. We're in the Southeast Conference. Our women's basketball team just won the national title over here, made huge news. And so it's a great place to be. We have a phenomenal faculty. I think we're the only university that has 3 former presidents of the American College of Sports Medicine as faculty. Yeah, pretty remarkable. And then I was past president of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. Before, kind of actually it overlapped with me moving down here. But most of my background's endocrinology. So I deal a lot in hormonal responses, biomarkers, biochemical responses. But we're really looking at ways both through training and nutrition to optimize human performance and human health. And I think that's probably, to kind of put all this in context as we start talking about this, is the one thing I've very much moved away in my career that I think we deal in a little too much sometimes is sufficiency. And I much prefer the idea of optimization, right? Because it's very hard to do that, but in the process of chasing it, you can accomplish some really good things when you really commit to that excellence. And so that's really the approach I come from. And the other thing too that I think has really resonated with me over the last 12, 15 years is that health and performance are not mutually exclusive. Right. And so it's that notion that the best ability is availability when it comes to an athlete. And I think that'll probably wind up being a theme as we talk today because of the approach that I tend to take with nutrient timing because of that.
No, it is. I'm really pleased you mentioned that concept of availability is critical and yet often misunderstood, but also just completely ignored. It doesn't matter how much training you're doing or what incredible supplement routines you're on, or this, that, and the other. If you don't actually make it for the competition and you're not actually available to compete, it was all pointless. So you're right. And that's what Fueling Greatness is all about. It's the various aspects of nutrition and lifestyle, etc., that leads to, holistically will lead to an individual or a team being able to perform at their very best. And that could be just somebody looking great when they look in the mirror, all the way up to an Olympic athlete. This is all the same thing because they're humans. They're not just athletes. Right. So how did you, look, you've got an epic sort of CV, loads of publications. I know I've met you loads of times. You're a strong guy. This is obviously a personal passion for you. Why this? You could have done other things with your career. You could have gone into medicine maybe, or you could have joined the military. Like what led to this particular path for you?
I was an athlete, right? And it was one of those things that ultimately my preferred choice would have been to play professionally for as long as possible. When that started to not materialize for much longer, it was actually funny. I was trying to decide when I was in college what I was going to do next, right? And I thought about med school. I thought about military. My dad was in the Marine Corps, grew up in that my entire life. And I really wanted to fly jets, but the problem is my eyesight sucked. So I couldn't do that. But anyway, I remember it was funny. We had a sports psychologist who was working with our team at the university. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to him one day, and all of a sudden it was, those cartoons where like the light bulb goes off above their head. Yeah. If like literally that's what it felt like happened that day. And all of a sudden I went, oh my God, I know what I want to do. Like sports science, sports. I was really interested in sports psychology initially. And that's what took me to Arizona State for grad school. But I really quickly realized how much the physiology and the endocrine system really grabbed my attention. And so it's one of those things where I got to be honest, Laurent, it's like, I can't imagine doing anything else at this point. Like I love this field. It's frustrating at times because, especially on the nutritional side, everybody figures, well, I eat, so I'm an expert in nutrition, right? It's just the craziest thing. So, but I think that I've been very, very blessed to have the kind of career that I have. I've had some amazing people around me. I've had phenomenal students. Some of my doctoral students are just, they're more family to me than anything else. And I think that the one thing that maybe there's two things that I think have taken me by surprise with this. And one of the reasons why I'm so glad I went into this field, I never realized where it would take me, right? The number of things that I've seen, the number of experiences that I've had. And I know you've had some of these as well, right? With some of the professional and even national teams that you've worked with, right? And it's amazing. And the second part is part of what ties into today with you and I talking is the people I've met, right? It's remarkable the circle that we kind of have in this field and just amazing people, good people, great scientists, but even better people. And so I think from that standpoint, this field just made intuitive sense to me. I knew I didn't want to coach necessarily. I actually was originally in strength and conditioning. I was a strength coach for a while, but I realized that I happened to be a jock who was good at science, right? And so it was just one of those where it became a natural tie-in, and it's been an absolute phenomenal response to be able to stay so involved in sport. But on this side of it, and the relationships I've formed with some of the athletes I've worked with is just, I wouldn't trade it for the world.
It's a blessing to be passionate about something and be paid for it, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm the same as you. I mean, I love this stuff. I'm like, really? Is this work? People say,
I know.
you're going to do some work today. It's not work. I love it. I mean, it has its ups and downs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Working with athletes has its ups and downs, particularly the well-paid ones.
It's not as glamorous as everybody thinks. Everybody thinks it's this glamorous job, and I'll be honest. Like sometimes you're like, no, it's really not.
Yeah,
like
it's when they give you pots of urine and then just disappear, and then you discover it wasn't even their own urine; it was somebody else's urine. Like, thanks for that. Yeah,
that was great.
That's all I'm good for. That's all I'm good for. So listen, look, there's loads we could talk about, obviously.
Yeah.
The topic I really want to get into, as I said at the beginning, was this idea of nutrient timing.
Yeah.
And it's the concept itself, why it's a thing and how it can impact performance and in particular things like recovery. But yeah, let's keep in our mindset that thing that you said about availability, because I think that's a critical perspective. So you've published in this area a number of times. Just give us a little overview about this concept of nutrient timing.
So if we track it back, the whole concept of even terming it nutrient timing really started to evolve in the 80s with Portman and Ivy, right? And what they had identified is this notion that after a workout, with the activation of glucose transporters to be able to uptake glucose, the desire for the system to start to recover, and sort of the metabolic responses that are going on, they really termed that like kind of initial 45 minutes after training, the metabolic anabolic window. Right now, over the years, that metabolic part somehow got lost. It just became the anabolic window, the way people were interpreting it. And so we'll come back to that because that's sort of an important why I went in this direction with the work that we do. But I think when you look at it, really, nutrient timing's been around for a very long time. And I would say where it's been, so if we talk nutrient timing, I think there's 3 phases that we kind of set the stage with, but we should probably go ahead and say up front, the concept of timing is not limited to these phases. We can incorporate timing all day long, and we will. We'll talk about that. But you've got your pre-workout, your inter-workout, and your post-workout, which all together create the peri-workout period, right? So kind of from beginning to end. And there was quite a bit of work that was done very early in our field, especially on the inter-workout part, feeding carbohydrate during a workout, and what does it do to prolong, especially endurance performance? Then we started to see more on the pre side. What do we do in terms of a pre-workout meal? What does that do to sustain performance and keep glycogen availability high? We could even deal with that from like a carb loading standpoint. Right? So that all became a thing. And then post-workout, which is really where Ivy and Portman kind of made their mark, was this notion of now starting to prepare a recovery process. What's happened is over the years, that anabolic window started to become challenged. But what's interesting to me is it all stemmed from the concept of protein timing, which is one nutrient, not all nutrients, right? And so there was a meta-analysis that was done in 2013, and they basically found that, hey, you know what? The timing of protein really doesn't matter as long as you take in enough protein in the day. Okay, fair point. The problem is when you dive a little bit deeper into that meta-analysis, and what worried me about it is I started to see strength coaches and other coaches go, oh, you know what? I tell my athletes not to eat after workout now because it doesn't matter. And I'm going, oh my God, like I want to play your team. This is great. Thank you. But what I started to realize is when you dig deeper into those studies, the large majority of the studies were done on untrained individuals. Man, when you talk about the big mover in this, the training is going to be the big piece of this puzzle. So yeah, the timing of proteins probably not going to be particularly important. But the other thing is only about 2 or 3 of those studies were actually nutrient timing studies where they actually manipulated the time of administration of this. The others were just simply whether they gave protein or a placebo after the workout. And so it started to become a little bit of a problem to me because of what the messaging was I was seeing with that, not necessarily through any fault of the researchers, more through the problem and how it was being interpreted. And so we dove a little bit deeper into this and started to look at nutrient timing, not just protein timing, right? So it's not just about how big are your biceps, but what can you do with them too? And really much of that debate around the importance of protein post-workout was really around hypertrophy, strength a little bit, but mostly hypertrophy. Do you get much bigger doing it that way? Look, man, I think the way to approach this overall is, it's funny because it works well as a nutrient timing example, but it's like a cake, right? If you're not taking in enough protein in the day, like protein is the cake, right? That total protein amount, the timing becomes the icing. Right. So, yeah, you can time the hell out of your protein intake, but if you're not taking in a sufficient amount throughout the day, it's a drop in the bucket. So you got to take care of the low hanging fruit first. Then the other stuff can start to matter because then it has a little bit more relevance. And I would argue the group that it probably even means more for are those high level athletes, the elite athletes, where you're looking for those 1 or 2% or even 0.5% improvements compared to everybody else. For the general population, maybe not as big of a deal, though there are other examples of timing that can have real implications for weight loss as well as health, right? So the big picture part of it, we can kind of look at that. And now over time, we've even started to look at how you space your meals, especially from a protein feeding standpoint, and also nighttime feeding, right? That's another timing consideration. What happens if you feed at night before you go to bed? What does that do to metabolism? What does that do to repair and recovery? So I think now we're looking really at like a 24-hour stretch. It's all important. Some maybe just a little more important depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I love this topic for many reasons. Although when people start using cake analogies, Shawn, I start getting hungry. And
seriously,
I don't want people messing with my cake. I don't need a high protein cake. I just want high sugar, high fat cake. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So recently I did a podcast for Fueling Greatness with Professor Asker Ukendrup. And that one, we talked about nutritional periodization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people that will have listened to that podcast before this one will be going, hang on, is this the same thing or is it not? What's your thoughts?
It's related, but it's not necessarily the same thing, right? Because the nutritional periodization piece really revolves around what you're doing sort of throughout the year, treating it as a periodization part like your training. But it can also revolve within a day or a week when you're looking at maybe carb restricted training or periods where an athlete may need to lose weight versus times where you don't want them to. I think one of the cleanest examples of nutritional periodization is when you're working with a fighter, right? Because you can't have them eating the same thing and the same way all year long, especially once they hit fight camp, depending on how much weight you're trying to shift in order for them to make their next class. So, those are good examples of where we would apply this. So to be honest, the periodization piece, you look at it two ways. Either the periodization fits under nutrient timing or nutrient timing fits within the periodization piece, depending on what phase you're in and how you're manipulating it. And I think that where the nutritional periodization really winds up emphasizing the timing aspect is if you're training in a state of deficiency, right? We don't necessarily want to train in an optimal state all the time. It's kind of that notion of embrace the suck. There's times where suboptimal preparation. Now, you always want to compete in an optimal condition, right? That's a different story. But certain times at training, we may have to dig in a little bit and create these imperfect types of scenarios. And I would argue then what you do right after that to facilitate recovery and adaptation, that's where timing can be really important. Or if you're working with a fighter or an athlete who, and by the way, a fighter is an athlete. That just sounded really weird the way I said that. But I was like, oops, sorry. Now, if I said you're working with a bodybuilder or an athlete, that might be a different story. Now, when I look at it from that standpoint, though, when you're trying to fit that together, if you have somebody who's training multiple times a day, the periodization aspect becomes important, but timing winds up becoming critical to get you ready for the next bout, right? So, and I think that's where a lot of these conversations around timing forget that part of it, where you may have multiple sessions in a day or short recovery windows between sessions, or if you're working with an athlete playing in a tournament.
Yeah, no, exactly. That is exactly how it was presented and it's interpreted. And it's very interesting, as you've already said, when people talk about nutrient timing, historically, they're kind of really talking about protein timing, like you said, right? And it's very muscle hypertrophy sort of focused, it's about lifting and gaining and getting bigger and so on. Whereas when people talk about nutritional periodization, they're kind of talking about carbohydrates,
right?
Train low, train high, and also training the gut, that sort of thing. Now, it
absolutely
does not help, does it? That the scientists and the public are all speaking completely different languages, and maybe that's part of the problem. Is there's a lack of definitions on these things, but also there's a lack of consistency in the language that's used, even in the research, right? In the literature, you see seriously complicated, confused language being used.
Yeah, because people will actually, I'll give you an example where they'll confuse carb restricted training with fasted training. They're not necessarily one and the same. Carb restricted, you may still feed protein. You just don't feed carbohydrates. As a matter of fact, when you look at most of the studies that have shown a benefit to carb restricted training, it has not been fasted. It's when they fed protein. Where they didn't see the performance improvements was when they truly trained fasted, right? And so it wasn't until they started feeding protein to offset some of that you actually saw not only the mitochondrial adaptations, but the translation of performance. I think where we've done ourselves a disservice is I think there's too many people that have overgeneralized. Look, if you want to talk about protein timing, talk about protein timing. I have no problem with that. That is a legitimate conversation, but don't turn that into a global nutrient timing argument, because you're now missing all the other nutrients. You're focusing on one, and that's okay if you want to do that. Same thing even with nutritional periodization, right? Is funny enough, part of the reason why the focus is on carbohydrate there is, by and large, with your athletes, the one thing you don't really trade is their protein intake, right? Because that's kind of like your base filler. And then periodization kind of revolves around what else you pile on top of that and when, because we don't want to trade the anabolic aspect of what we're getting with protein from a recovery standpoint. So, again, I agree with you. Some of it is the terminology, but I think the catch is that's kind of funny is the problem isn't so much in the terminology, it's in our use of the terminology. It's the inconsistency or overgeneralization of what you're really talking about. And that's why I said, you want to talk about protein timing? Cool. Talk about protein timing. That is a legitimate, useful conversation. But don't make everybody think that means that all nutrients are unimportant at certain times. It depends on what you're trying to do. For hypertrophy purposes, I don't know, maybe that is the big conversation. But for an immune system, neurological system, aerobic adaptation standpoint, recovery between sessions, I hate to say it, but there's other nutrients that start to matter too, besides just protein. And I'm pro-protein, right? I'm a protein fan, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing that matters.
No, absolutely. And it is important to talk about this stuff. And using words like "it depends," because
yes,
it does really depend on an awful lot of things, and also a lot of this science is, well, we could have conversations about science, quality versus quantity of useful science, in terms of publications. There's all sorts of stuff out there, particularly in our field. It's pretty bad. And there are, look, you've only got on YouTube, one place you'll find this podcast, or social media, you're going to find a lot of people spewing out information and facts, and they will be using terms like nutrient timing, nutritional periodization, and so on, but they may not fully grasp the nuances and the where that body of knowledge came from, and how to differentiate, the parts that are relevant or irrelevant depending on who's even listening. I mean, frankly, a lot of this stuff, I'm sure you'll agree, I hope you do, is really not that relevant to your average person. I guess it's on a sliding scale, right? In fact, let's talk about that. Yeah. Let's talk about that first, because people's ears are pricking up when they're going nutrient timing. We got all these fancy words, haven't we? Relevance, my favorite word. How relevant is this anyway?
I would actually probably say more relevant than some people give it credit for, but not to the point that it should consume every waking moment of how you think about your nutritional intake, right? I think for the quote unquote average person, let's say active, more of the athletic individual, not the athlete, right? And there's a difference there. But I think when you start to look at that, the most important part, which is funny because it's true for athletes too, the most important part is the big picture stuff, right? Like, how much are you taking in a day, in a week, and whatever, and how does that tie to your training? Like, are you fueling for the work necessary in order to do that. All right. So that's part one. And then the other part is, are you sleeping enough? Are you hydrating? Right. All of those things matter way more than going, oh my God, I need to have a protein shake as soon as I'm done with my workout. Right. No, like you got to take care of the other stuff first. But I will say, what I find interesting is there's some really cool work in food science that has actually shown that even the order in which you eat your food in a meal changes its metabolizable energy and the insulinogenic response, the overall hormonal responses. So timing actually does matter, right? But not to the point where you should become consumed with it in terms of how much that beats up. But so I would say if people are looking to optimize their health, right? And I would argue that, okay, maybe we're not worried about, what your fastest 5K, 10K performance is, or, how much you bench, all that's good. And you want to be able to do those things, but you're not looking to win at those things, but you're looking to win at life, right? So the health part of it starts to matter. Then some of the other things that we think about with timing and how you combine these foods and when you combine these foods, I think does start to matter if you're trying to get the most out of your efforts. But again, if you're missing the boat on the big stuff, you can time the crap out of everything else and it's not going to matter, right? So it's pay attention to the big movers, then you can play with the timing aspect. I think that the thing that I think the lesson I've taken from this area is, do you need to eat right after a workout? Not necessarily. Like there's a window there, but why wouldn't you? I think that's what I keep defaulting back to is what good does it do to wait for some of these things? And even if we look at somebody who is trying to lose body fat, who is trying to be healthier, why not take advantage of the physiological response to exercise that helps with muscular uptake of glucose to store as glycogen? Why not facilitate that pathway instead of waiting or instead of staying in a catabolic state? And I think, this is where the experts have created problems for us. Where I see it personally, because of what I'm trained in and what I do, is I see this a lot with biomarkers, right? All of a sudden, because somebody can get their blood work done, all of a sudden everybody's an expert in how to interpret biomarkers, most of them with no endocrine background. And it scares the crap out of me because you want to talk about context and nuance, like understanding how all of those things fit together and what they mean collectively versus one marker. That's another big thing. So again, we see it translating across multiple of these areas where just because it seems like it can be simple doesn't necessarily mean it is. That being said, I also don't think we need to overcomplicate some things either, right? Eat enough, get your protein, sleep, hydrate. We're a good part of the way. Lift heavy stuff, run, right? Like you can do these things. Like we're way ahead of the curve already. But yeah, those are some of the things we battle on a regular basis with this.
Yeah, that last part, Shawn, is I think I'm going to make that a clip, and that's just going to be the whole podcast.
That's all it is, right?
Was 3 seconds long. That was it. Yeah, that's the end. No,
it's like when I teach endocrinology, I tell my students, okay, so here's the lesson. I go, when you exercise, everything goes up except insulin, which goes down. We're done, right? Yeah, so it's sometimes you can just boil it down. Yeah, yeah. But this, in all seriousness, one of the things that just consumes me is this gap that exists between science and practice, and there is. Yeah. On the one hand, there's an emphasis on things like statistical significance, but then there's also practical relevance that we have to take into account. Thank you.
I think that's a big reason for taking this seriously, and I agree with you. This is relevant to most people as long as you actually understand what this stuff means. So if we dial back to the beginning of this concept of nutrient timing, I think you've done a great job of giving us some history, some overview. There is some research that has gone into this. It's ongoing, of course, and you're one of the people contributing to that. But I think one thing we need to go back to is why it's important. Why do we need to do nutrient timing?
Yeah. So I think when you look at it, it's let's take it from an athlete perspective. It's probably the easiest way to conceptualize this. So there's two reasons, both of which are intertwined. One is to optimize performance, and the second part is to optimize recovery to further optimize performance, right? So there is both a single session effect in terms of doing what you can to fuel for that work you're about to do, especially in competition, in matches and things like that. And then the other part revolves around your training, which is now what do I do after this or even during it to facilitate me being ready to train again? Right. And so if you look at it, weird comparison, I know, but bear with me on this. But if we use anabolic steroids as an example here, one of the things that they allow you to do is train harder more frequently. Right. It facilitates recovery. So taking that now to just purely the nutritional realm, if you can do things that allow you to train harder more frequently, you are going to facilitate greater adaptation, right? You're going to win more races. You're going to win more matches. You're going to get bigger. So when we look at it from that standpoint, the reason it starts to matter is because of what it does to set the stage for sort of this long-term progress, as well as what we're doing within it. And again, do you have to pay attention to this every time, every day? No, there's going to be some times where it's not a particularly hard workout or it was easy to adjust for. But then there's other times, especially in the peak of your training, where you want to dial everything up as ideally as you can in that scenario, because what good does it do to not, right? And I think that to me is the why behind it. And then I think from a more global standpoint, if you're looking at more general population, it really revolves around optimizing health and getting the most out. If we look at it as a return on investment, I think the reality is the very little it actually costs you to pay attention to the timing helps you get that much more out of the efforts you're investing in your training, the money you're spending on your food, the time you're putting into trying to take care of yourself. Why not maximize that ROI? Because when you do that, if you look at your capacity as like a bank account, in any given week, you only have so much money to withdraw, right? And for an athlete, the most important thing is rent due every week, right? When you have a game, when you have a match, that's the one you have to budget for. You do not want to go overdrawn in that. So you budget throughout the week to do this. Well, if you do all these other little things right in terms of how you structure your training and how you feed around these things, what you do is you increase your account, where you have more money to spend, or it takes a lot, or you're earning a lot of interest, right? Because now that interest on that investment is just that much greater. And so now you make progress from season to season, from year to year. So I think to me, that's why it matters, because it may not be the single biggest, most important thing. You know, your consistency of training and your sleep and recovery, that's all going to be a part of it too. But it's not something that I would ignore. And, one example I use is we work with college athletes a lot, right? So they may have training in the morning and then they all have to class. So one of the reasons we make sure they eat right after training is I don't know when they're going to eat again, right? So timing for us is a pragmatic, practical issue where it's like, why would I not make sure they get food in them as soon as we're done? Because now they got to go off to class and it may be hours before they eat again. I don't want them in that state for too long. At least we've kind of topped off and gotten the process started in that case. So there's a very practical side to this too.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge reason for it, because most people, athletes, regular people, are busy people.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Whether you're just going to the gym, in your lunch break, well, firstly, you're working out rather than having lunch. And then, you're going to be aware that you've got deadlines, meetings or whatnot. It's quite easy to see a scenario where you get your workout, you go back to the office, and then you completely miss a feed. Yeah. So having that protein or protein carbohydrate post-workout shake, it is a relevant strategy. And yes, some people will go, well, how about a food first approach? Why can't we just have, pasta and chicken or rice and, beef? Yeah, but you can't cook that up in the locker room, right? So they both work, I think, though, is important.
Yes, so, absolutely. Yeah. And I agree. Food first in terms of like, we want you to eat food, like, and actually from a metabolism and from a health standpoint, whole foods are a largely better source throughout the day, but there's a time and a place for supplements, for processed food to give you what you need really quick. I mean, can you imagine if you're in a triathlon, you're on the bike and you're like, okay, I can either have this gel or I can munch away on a bagel, right? Like, I mean, now you're choking down bread versus just putting goo, and drinking it down. There's a time and a place, right? So it's not, to me, it's not an either or. And it's so weird to me when people treat it that way. Like, you don't need supplements. No, you don't need them. But if you want to perform at your highest, you may want them, right? Because there's a time and a place for this. But yeah, I've never understood. I think the discourse has just become so polarizing for no good reason. And I feel like we've lost the middle ground where it's like, yeah, eat real food and here's some supplements that can help you too, right? I don't understand why we've gone so extreme on that.
No, completely agree. I mean, that's one of my missions with this podcast is to talk to people about this sort of thing. Experts, not influencers. Some of the experts happen to be quite influential, but
yes, correct. Fair.
But we've all got different perspectives on what an influencer is, of course. Yeah. But if you don't understand the strengths and limitations of, said strategy, then you really don't understand whether you should or shouldn't do it. And, again, something that came out of my conversation with Professor Eukendrup was this idea that, you can do all these things, but it doesn't mean that you absolutely should do those things. In fact, sometimes it's a pretty smart thing to be able to determine when not to do something.
Yes.
That requires a lot of knowledge and experience, obviously. But look, we're coming back to nutrient timing. We're kind of focusing on protein and carbohydrates. Yes, it could be other things like timing of caffeine or timing of sodium bicarbonate or whatever. There's all sorts of things, but we haven't got forever to talk about these things. So the big levers in this, particularly as it relates to strength, power, etc., adaptations, and yes, definitely endurance, will be protein and carbohydrates. Now, if people eat 3 times a day, they're already timing to a certain extent some of these foods. So when we talk about nutrient timing, how does that differentiate itself from training before, or after, or in the middle of these gaps between these pretty established meals that we have?
In some ways, what it does is nutrient timing gets replaced by training timing, right? So in other words, you've timed your training around your nutrition, maybe rather than the other way around. It's still it's two sides to the same coin when you do that. I think the other thing too that gets interesting with this, and I know here's another area where there's just been so much like, you don't need to do this, it doesn't help, is more frequent meals, right? More frequent meals don't help with weight loss, more frequent meals. You know what's funny? If you actually go back to one of the meta-analyses that was done on this, they removed an outlier because one of the studies actually showed that the meal frequency did matter. But they removed that and all of a sudden meal frequency didn't matter. They considered an outlier. But the interesting thing is if you actually look at what that outlier study was, it was the only one that included exercise. So actually in that case, when you include exercise, meal frequency actually did make a difference in body composition changes. I wouldn't consider that an outlier. I'd consider that a lesson, right? So we look at that. And so the devil's in the details. Now, the reason that becomes important is, okay, if we look at, we'll use protein as a perfect example of this. And I could argue carbohydrate easily, and we will here in a second. But if you have an athlete that you're trying to get in, just to make it simple, 1 gram per pound of body weight, so 2.2 grams per kilogram, whatever. Honestly, with what we see with typical feedings, that may be very difficult to do in 3 meals. So actually more frequent meals, and especially ones timed around your training, one of those could be your post meal, allows you just one more opportunity to feed, to hit that leucine threshold, right? To kind of stimulate this response. So there's an upside to that. And I would argue from a carbohydrate standpoint, if you look at what it takes to replenish glycogen, and again, there's been plenty that's been shown, and I know I've heard plenty of discussion from, influencers and experts of, well, you know what, you don't have to have a ton of carbohydrate right after your workout. Within 24 hours, it'll replenish. That's great, but that's not under full carb depletion scenarios like a soccer match. Because if they're using like resistance training as an example, most even high intensity resistance training bouts, maybe 40% glycogen depletion. Yeah, your replenishment of that honestly isn't that hard. On the other hand, a soccer match, we go back to the classic work of Bengt Saltine. You're talking 90 to 96% glycogen depletion. And now if you got a match that's turning around, and we've seen even with females, it may take even longer to glycogen replenish, right? Yeah, you better get right on that, right? Why are you not taking advantage of that window, that garage door of opportunity after your training, after your competition, to get as much in as you can? And so in that case, even real frequency becomes important with carbs, because you may not be able to take in 400 grams of carbs all at one time. But if you're doing that over multiple hours, again, that's frequent refeedings, right? So I think we're too quick to jump on, meal frequency doesn't matter. I said, my thing would be, again, back to your point, it depends. Like, what are we talking about for the average individual? And if they're hitting their macronutrient needs and they're eating good foods and they're staying otherwise healthy, 3 meals versus 5 meals, as long as it's calorie matched, probably not a big difference. But for an athlete, and especially if you're training multiple times a day, you know what? Yeah, it actually does matter, and that's to be fair, that's a hard thing to quantify in a study, because it's so rare to be able to work with truly elite athletes in an experimental manipulation setting, depending on where they're at in their season. I got to give Louise Burke and her group tremendous props for what they've managed to do with Olympic level race walkers with some of the supernova studies. That is not an easy thing to do. We've been very lucky with the work we do.
Recruiting elite athletes, that's the bit. How did you get that?
Yeah, and that is amazing. And we've been fortunate with some of the athletes we've worked with our studies, because of the relationships that we have and that we've built over years, that we truly do have some elite athletes in our studies, and we're seeing some remarkable things. But that's a special scenario, right? And so we have to be careful how broadly we paint that picture of meal frequency, of protein timing, of nutrient timing. Because even a small difference can make a pretty big difference when it comes to winning medals.
So if we go back to some of the words that we've used, like optimization, recovery, even health, and I'm thinking the impact on the immune system, for example, these are all really interesting areas. And yes, this stuff's super important for elite athletes, particularly, like you say, ones that are involved in like tournament football, like I've worked a lot in tournament soccer. Or indeed, and a lot of people don't realize that they're still potentially doing, albeit light training sessions, the same day that they have a match later in the day, and the day before, the coach might have smashed them around the gym, because that's just how some coaches are. There's all sorts of things there. There's not necessarily a realization of the sort of depletion of fuel that it goes on, but also the amount of time it does take the bottle. Where did that come from? The body, the immune system, not just the muscle, to recover from these things. So not everyone's an elite athlete that's listening, right? In fact, lots of them won't be, but for most people, they're going to be into training in some form, and the outcomes matter. So let's focus a bit on nutrient timing and its potential for optimizing training adaptations, recovery, and other parameters like health and immune system.
So, it's fine. I'm really glad you brought up the immune system, because to me, when we often have these conversations around nutrient timing, especially when what they really mean is protein timing, much of it is just focused, like we said before, on hypertrophy and maybe strength to some degree. But it misses the areas where protein also goes to facilitate things, neurotransmitters, the immune system in terms of what it does to the cytokine pathways and the ability for immune system response. And carbohydrates play a role here too, because there's plenty of studies now that have shown that feeding carbohydrate after an intense workout closes that window of immunocompromise, right? So it helps shrink that quite a bit. And so when you're in a scenario with high training demands or high environmental stress and things like that, the ability to facilitate immune function shouldn't be ignored in this, right? And I think we forget that protein doesn't just go to making bigger muscles, right? It plays a key role in enzymes, in a number of blood markers, especially hemoglobin. When you look at, iron carrying molecules that are, protein based, you look at, again, we miss the finer points of that. And I think that's where that concept of using this to get the most out of your training and recovery is so critical, because it's one of those things that it just speeds up your ability to do this again. And I would argue, especially now that I'm definitely on the old side of old, at least I feel like it, I would say this is something that we really should very much pay attention to as we age, because that recovery actually does get more challenging, right? When you start looking at everything from anabolic resistance to, preventing any degree of sarcopenia and the role that it interplays with training, I would say in that case, it's worth paying attention to. Again, it doesn't have to be all you pay attention to, but why not make it a part of your nutritional strategy? It's really not that complicated. I mean, it's really not. I think that's the part that maybe frustrates me the most is when people kind of crap on nutrient timing and it's like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's like, but it's not even complicated to implement. Like, it's not that hard to do. They make it sound like remembering to have a shake after your workout might be the biggest demand on your time that was ever created. Like, powder in a mixer, add some water, we're good, right? Like, we scored. And so it's the fact that it's really not that complicated. And I know for us, when we work with like our college athletes, just teaching them how simple that is to do carries over, right? Good habits are as hard to break as bad habits. So when you start to build these things in, it just becomes part of what you do from a strategy standpoint.
I'm glad you mentioned aging. I mean, I don't wish to be reminded too much about how we're all getting older because, hey,
it's better than the alternative.
It is true. But there is a lot more research on aging populations, but also aging athletes. There's all sorts. Yes, there's a growing. Well, there's always been masters athletes, but we're trying to get older people to train because of the consequences of sarcopenia and osteoporosis and all the wonderful things that exercise does, not just for young, athletes, young people generally, but for older people. But this area of anabolic resistance is very interesting. And of course, that ties into this benefit of nutrient timing for older people as well. Do you want to just quickly discuss that? Because not everyone probably knows what I'm talking about.
So I think the simplest way to describe it is with aging, and especially with sedentary aging, we can prevent this a bit with resistance training. But with aging, the muscle becomes less able to handle protein's influence on muscle protein synthesis. So what happens is it actually takes more protein to exert the same effect that a little bit less would have when you were younger. It's called anabolic resistance, where it takes more to turn the key to get muscle protein synthesis started, right? And it's probably a little bit of overgeneralization. I realize that, but it works for our example here. And so the idea is that either with adding more protein and or timing that with periods of time where you are particularly in a positive way susceptible to the influence of the amino acids in that protein, can actually help overcome most or all of this relative resistance. And so one of those times is after training, right? Because this is where that window opens up where we are actually able to metabolize, utilize, and facilitate recovery from, this amino acid influx that comes with the protein itself. And certainly even then, moving beyond it, it's not like carbohydrate doesn't help increase muscle protein synthesis, but carbohydrate feeding has been shown to reduce muscle protein breakdown. So there's a balancing act there. And so even that overall nutritional feeding after can help in both respects. And so that's really where, again, why not, right? Like, take advantage of that, when we talk about this window after exercise, when we go back to the anabolic window, IV Portman is really the metabolic and anabolic window. The argument I've heard is, okay, that window can be as much as 24 to 48 hours. So it doesn't really matter when you eat in that, right? Like, as long as you're eating, you're fine. But I look at it like, well, okay, if that window is like 24 hours, why would I not fit as much in that window as possible, right? And so I think, and we talk about this in one of the articles that we wrote, but, we've moved past this anabolic window. And the way I look at it now, the way I express it to the athletes and the other people I work with is, it's a garage door of opportunity, right? You can actually fit, the door's bigger than we thought, right? So you got a little wider time frame here, but you can also fit a lot more through there. And so why wouldn't you do this, right? And to me, you brought up an interesting point before about, should we do these things? One of my favorite sayings is, just because we can doesn't mean we should, right? And that applies to a lot of things in life. But when we look at it, can you wait to eat? Sure, you can, but should you? That's the part that doesn't compute for me is like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think people have taken it to an extreme. And I think scientifically, it's important for us to understand that, yes, it's a much bigger time frame than we originally suspected. That's great for us to know. But the practical side of me goes, great. That actually gives me more opportunity to feed, not less. Right? Why would I skip out on that? That's the part that's never made sense to me.
Yeah, no, it's good news. That means it's good news.
Yes, absolutely.
So look, a lot of this does still boil down to the consumption of certain foods or components found within food, macronutrients typically, protein and carbohydrate, for example, acutely or proximal to a training session. And you've already explained this comes down to three things, right? So it's before, during, and then is it or is it and after? So I think that's an interesting point you make in your paper there.
It's an and. I think too many people treat it as an or, but again, one of those areas is, so let's say, for example, if you don't like to have a heavy fluid intake or protein intake during your workout, right? Fine. Feed after, right? It all fits together. But I feel like we focus so much on the before or after that I'm kind of like, well, what about before and after? Especially if you work with an athlete who trains for multiple hours. Okay, so for example, Michelle right now, my wife, is she's the director of sport nutrition for South Carolina Athletics for the Olympic sports. And so she's working with baseball right now. Baseball, those are 3 and 4 hour games sometimes, right? And they might have 2 and 3 hour practices. So when you look at how long that time is between, you need to eat before and after. And honestly, for a lot of the pitchers in game, they'll feed them during to some degree as well to keep them ready. So it becomes a before, during, and after, not a before, during, or after. Now, what we do need to realize, though, is, and I think this is true both for athletes, but very much so for more general population, what you might do within that time frame may make other parts of it a little less important. So, for example, if you are already coming in glycogen replenished, your pre-workout meal is probably going to be less important than it would have been if you were not. So, for example, if I have an athlete with an early morning training session, they haven't eaten all night, they've slept, they come in, I want to make sure we get a pre-workout meal in there. That's going to be important. If they're a little later in the day and they've eaten multiple times and we're kind of topped off, I'm like, if they don't want to eat an hour or so before their training session, they probably don't need to, right? So again, relevance becomes important. Flip side of that too is if you take in protein before that workout and the workout's only say an hour, honestly, what you do right after becomes a little less important because you've already facilitated the response by what you did before. On the other hand, if you didn't do anything before, what you do after becomes even more important, right? So it's understanding that continuum and how each phase impacts and influences the other one. This is why we try to treat it as an and. It doesn't mean you have to do everything in its entirety within each of those phases. It's recognizing what you may or may not have done within that phase to set up how much you need to do next, right? Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think actually, maybe if I could have you explain some of the consequences, a little bit of maybe mechanistically, what happens if you don't consume things like protein and carbohydrate proximal to a training session? Maybe at this point we can focus more on your slightly more average training sessions. People are going to the gym. Okay. For the usual reasons. It's either to body composition manipulation and or get stronger, hypertrophy, that sort of thing. What are the consequences of not doing this? Because I think we've argued that there's quite a lot here, but I think let's understand why.
Okay, so Do you remember the line in Jurassic Park where they say nature finds a way? Right. So, I mean, granted, we're talking about dinosaurs there, but the point is, when you think about what it takes for your body to respond and handle a physiological stress, the body finds a way, nature finds a way. And what happens is, if you're not fueling, so you're not providing these exogenous sources, the system will take endogenous just fine, right? And so what'll happen is you'll use the muscle glycogen that's available. Great. That could become a limiting factor. And this is one of the reasons why exogenous carbohydrate, what you're taking in, helps preserve some of that. So now with a little more intense workout, you got a little more left in you towards the end of the workout. That's a good thing. All right. The other part too is, if you think about what happens post-workout, if you don't eat, right, the system is in a catabolic state by definition, because and this isn't a bad thing, by the way. Let me use cortisol as an example. Cortisol is a fun hormone. It's the one I study the most, but acutely, cortisol is absolutely necessary from a training standpoint, right? Because it mobilizes your fuel and resources. Cortisol staying high chronically is a bad thing, because it now puts you in a chronically catabolic state, highly responsive to stress and things like that. So what we want cortisol to respond during this high intensity workout, but then we want to try to get it recovered as fast as possible after, so that the replenishment, the regeneration can actually start. So if you're not taking in the fuels that are needed to offset that response, and that includes catecholamine response, it includes cortisol response, and also taking advantage of the ability to transport carbohydrates, your system will continue to break down certain proteins in order to provide the glucose necessary to do this, right? That's why even on a ketogenic diet, people can still store glycogen, but they get it from other sources. It's a more expensive process to do that versus taking in carbohydrates. So when you look at, if you're waiting, if you're not replenishing, you're not refueling, the system will try to take it from somewhere else. So now your ability to sort of maximize whatever hypertrophy was going to occur is severely mitigated, because you're cutting into the very process that allows for that repair and replenishment. Now, how big of a deal is that? It depends on the person, depends on the frequency of their training, it depends on their muscle mass. So it would be hard to put a blanket statement to that. And I don't want to make it sound like dire consequences, but yes, there is a consequence to not eating, right? And it's kind of like, I hear this too when people, it's kind of when they're like, you should fast, because fasting creates autophagy and or autophagy, and it'll create all these other things where you're using all these other fuels, and it's such a great thing. And it's like, okay, and it increases growth hormones, my favorite one. And I'm like, yeah, it does, but now you've actually impaired muscle protein synthesis, so you actually lose muscle. It's one of those where you got to look at the concept in its entirety in order to do this, and it gets lost in translation sometimes.
Yeah, well, that's the problem when people think they know what they're talking about. And that's when I start describing it as not only ignorance, but ignorance of one's own ignorance on a topic.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
That's this stuff is complex, and
it is.
You're a professor working in this field full time, and you've done it now for many years, and it's still something that you're learning about, isn't it?
On a regular basis. And honestly, I think, again, going back to the comment I had made at the beginning of this, where appreciating that, the best ability is availability, and that health and performance are not mutually exclusive. Honestly, Laurent, early in my career, I treated health and performance and athletes as two very different things, right? It's like we'll push ourselves into extremes sometimes. And it's not necessarily about the health part of it. It's like, what do we do to optimize performance? That's what I'm worried about. And then you grow, you mature, you do research, and you go, oh, wow, you know what? If we can actually improve their health at the same time, they play a lot better too. And again, it's that process of filtering through the things we learn as we go with this. And I would say sports science to me is an amazing field, because you just look at what we've learned in the last decade, even the last 5 years, and we still have people relying on stuff. And again, the classical work is still so important. Some of it holds up over time. You look at, again, we mentioned saltine. Those works were done in the 60s. Right? They still hold up. They still stand the test of time because they were so well done, but they form our knowledge base for what we're seeing now. And I mean, honestly, perfect example, let's use carbohydrate. Like what do we know that we didn't appreciate before? Well, we thought that the maximal oxidation rate that you could sustain would be about 60 grams per hour, until we realized that if you use multiple carbohydrate transporters, so you use glucose and fructose, it can be upwards of maybe 90 to even 120 grams per hour, right? So the things we learn in that process and how we combine these fuel sources allows you to maybe do even more. But what's funny is there's a pro triathlete I've been working with, and we actually figured out that while he could take in 120 grams per hour, it actually was not ideal for him. It actually created a little bit too much of a gut challenge for him. Even though we trained the gut during the training process, we backed down to 90. It was actually the year he turned pro, right? So he actually wound up really crushing it in the qualifying race, because even though you're thinking, again, even though we can, should we, right? It was like, you can take in 120 grams per hour, but should he? No, that was a lesson we learned, right? Is that didn't get us, we actually wound up focusing a bit more on the electrolytes and hydration process. That's where we were missing an opportunity. And so we traded some of the carbohydrate to do a little bit more of that. Worked out brilliantly, right? But it was because we systematically tried to apply this. So yeah, it's an area that grows, develops. I learn something new every year. There's things that still hold the test of time, though, that, I'm like, yeah, we knew that a while back and it still works. And things that we just do a little bit better now.
It's that comment you made about nature finds a way, which I find is that's a great way of saying it. Because it's absolutely fascinating that the body will always, it'll just keep going. It'll function, right? So if you train in a glycogen depleted state, it adapts to that in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Certain things happen. Yeah. If you, and you use the phrase availability, and yes, we're kind of using that phrase maybe more to have a player available for training. But if we use availability for things like substrate availability, energy availability, which links back to nutrient timing, because you either are or you are not making available these substrates, these nutrients, and the consequences of that substance being available or not available, and the downstream adaptations that occur can be really quite fascinating. Maybe we could just briefly talk a bit about that, because there might, when I talk to Prof, you can droop about this stuff, ask her. Yeah. There are reasons to train in a glycogen depleted state, because those adaptations can have their uses, right? So it sort of goes in both directions.
So I want to use that example because it's a great one. So this is something I talk about and I work a lot in team sports, right? So with glycogen availability, right? If we're talking about sort of this glycogen depleted state, where I've been concerned is that if where has all that work been done? It's been done in cyclists almost exclusively and somewhat in runners. What has concerned me is that based on those results, which they saw some positive outcomes, certainly, especially when there was protein availability, but what people missed is they didn't do it every day, right? Usually the training in a glycogen depleted state was maybe 3 days a week, and it was always steady state training, right? The second part was all of a sudden I started seeing strength coaches and people like that start to use this in team sports. The problem is that's not steady state training. And now what I worry about is when you're talking about rapid accelerations, you're talking about agility, you're talking about decision making and stuff like that. I ideally don't want my athletes in a glycogen depleted state. I'm not looking for them to suffer in that. There's other things we can do within the training session to create a challenge to force adaptation. But we also have to think about how this is being applied. Now, on the other hand, if you're in more of your off season and you're doing some basic conditioning with your athletes, could there be a time and a place for glycogen depleted training there? Sure, but not when they're on the ball. Right. That actually concerns me because there has been no work on that to suggest that works. And I would actually say, if nothing else, we elevate the risk of injury in that case. So we need to think about what's necessary and why. And so with the glycogen depleted training, we have the advantage of being able to utilize more fat for fuel in those sessions, especially when they're steady state. So we're forcing some of this metabolic response to use other fuels, but also to challenge the system to come up with ways to handle low glycogen. When you're working in a team sports setting, you're looking at rapid decision making. You're looking at the ability to cut and turn and plant and create a rapid force. those things could be very counterproductive because you do want the availability of glycogen in those situations and ATP PCR to be able to overcome the challenges in that type of setting. So I think that availability really comes down to what the event is and where you're at in your training, because certainly we're not going to want to compete in a carb depleted state. Practice, training, sure, especially with running, cycling, and things like that. But when it comes time for competition, there's no upside to that, right? So it's forcing these adaptations, and it's kind of like taking the approach like special operators take, within the military, is that notion of embrace the suck, right? There's certain times where it's going to be really freaking hard, and it's okay for us to make those things challenging for the system to force adaptation. But how you recover from that is also what matters, because what's key is in all those glycogen depletion or in the carb depleted studies, when they're looking at this, as soon as that steady state session was over, they fed, right? So they didn't stay carb depleted. They had a hard training session the night before, depleted glycogen, didn't fully replenish that, trained again in the morning at a steady state, forced these other adaptations in a suboptimal kind of way for what the system had to handle, but then they fed. Why? Because that's where you're going to get your adaptation. Right now, we're going to repair and recover. You have done the work in a depleted state, but we don't want to stay depleted. So that's where, again, I would argue in those studies, they absolutely use nutrient timing, right? It's just that you're manipulating it to create a suboptimal into optimal type of scenario in that case.
Absolutely. And look, I mean, this stuff is very nuanced, obviously. It depends all day long. It depends. But, it's not just a case of you either nutrient time or you don't. There are going to be some things like, well, what about dose? Because it is obviously a scenario where you're just overdoing it, which some people go, but you don't need that protein shake because you've already had enough calories that day. What about dose? How dose dependent is this concept?
I think highly, right? But here's what's hard is there's two doses we need to look at. One is what occurs within the day, right? So you're looking at that total intake. And then the second part is what's occurring at that point in time. And it's funny because the dose, God, talk about it depends. The dose also depends on what else you're doing within that. So for example, ideally, when we look at carbohydrate for glycogen replenishment after a glycogen depleting type of scenario, you're talking 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per hour, right? That can be a lot of carbohydrate very quickly. And for a lot of people, that's a lot to handle when you're looking at that piling up. On the other hand, though, what we see is that protein can help with glycogen replenishment if carbohydrate intake is under that 1 gram per kilo per hour. So if that's the case, if you have an athlete who maybe has a hard time eating that much carbohydrate, we have a lot of them, and especially, to be fair, like with some of our female athletes, they look at that value, they go, oh my God, that is a lot of carbohydrate, right? Like mentally, that's very hard for them. As long as you feed protein with it at about 0.4 grams per kilogram within that dosing, if you feed protein with it, it actually helps with the glycogen replenishment. So now you're modifying your dose of carbohydrate based on your corresponding dose of protein. On the other hand, if you don't do that, it may take more carbohydrate to produce the same effect for glycogen replenishment. So the dose is variable depending on how it's manipulated. And one of my favorite examples, and where we often miss out on an opportunity, is I think some of those fascinating work on glycogen replenishment is with caffeine. We think of caffeine as the ability to fuel a workout, right? To kind of increase the overall response, the endurance, and things like that. But what's really cool is there's some really great studies showing that caffeine intake post-training with carbohydrate facilitates glycogen replenishment by up to 66%, right? And one study was, I think it was 2 milligrams per kilogram intake, and another one it was up to 8 milligrams per kilogram. So, when you look at this, it depends on, how you're fitting that in. But again, even caffeine can actually have a positive effect here. I think that's kind of cool.
It's more than cool. It's just, I love caffeine, by the way. Well, in the form of coffee in particular. But that's why I love this topic so much, as in this field of sports nutrition and sports science. I mean, there's so much stuff that we can do. And talking about stuff we can do, let's get into some practical stuff here. So, we could probably keep talking forever, but then we're going to need some of that cake that you've been talking about, and
along with the coffee you were just talking about.
Exactly. You see where I'm going. So look, nutrient timing, there's going to be roughly three scenarios. People are either looking, through their training, etc., through their endeavors each day to lose weight, or more specifically, not that they may not use this phrase, but optimize their body composition, because you don't want to only lose weight. Or they want to improve performance. And maybe there's two angles there. There's those that want to get sort of bigger, faster, stronger. And then there's going to be, of course, endurance athletes. So if we tackle the weight loss body composition piece first, what are your thoughts about nutrient timing and its relevance to that?
I think it's one of those things where, if your focus is the body composition change, wow, the amount of carbohydrate intake is something you're going to have to really work within, right? Because that's probably, you don't want to trade protein. So where are you going to potentially cut calories? It's probably going to be through fat and carbohydrate. And I would say for them, maybe the most important part of this equation is what you do after the workout, because that's where you're primed to be able to utilize carbohydrate uptake into the muscle, but it's also where you're going to want to emphasize the protein intake. So they can now afford to have a little less carbohydrate intake because they have the protein along with it. So we still facilitate glycogen replenishment. And what they might do is just be able to gauge sort of that pre-workout meal, maybe a little bit more modest, depending on what their workout is going to consist of. I would also say where they need to pay attention is if they're using like multiple sessions a day to do it. So for example, they might do some aerobic work in the morning, maybe go for a walk, and then they lift later in the day. Fueling in between those is also useful, because the one thing even if you're trying to cut calories, even if you're trying to lose the body fat, the quality of your training will also influence that response. So you don't want to sacrifice the quality of your training by just starving yourself either. So I would say for them, the timing can become very important. And I would specifically say, if nothing else throughout the day, minimizing, or maybe a better way of looking at it is maximizing fiber intake, your, cruciferous vegetables and things like that. And then around your training is where you have more of your high energy carbohydrates versus the low energy. I think that in and of itself is a useful timing strategy for them, and probably even more important than in some athletes, we may want high carb or high energy carbohydrate at multiple times throughout the day, depending on their training sequence. For somebody looking to change body composition, I would say that the around training time is the optimal time, where if you are going to have those high energy carbs, that's then. And then on the other side of it, mostly focusing on protein, high fiber intake, things like that change the metabolizable energy.
Yeah, and of course, look, I mean, and this will link to the next two segments there on this topic, but, we've already discussed there's a relevance to nutrient timing and how it can impact, the workout itself.
Right.
And therein lies benefits, you'll burn more calories potentially, or more importantly, maybe is you will increase the stimulus, the adaptation, that result in more lean muscle mass, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talking of lean muscle mass and concepts like strength and power, bigger muscles, that sort of thing. And this is where nutrient timing has been very popular, of course.
Yeah, it has. Yeah.
You've got your bros in the gym, obviously taking pills between each set, even. You know how that goes. But it does have an impact. And how does it impact?
In that case, it multiple ways, and you really just touched on both, even when we were talking about the weight loss part of it. But it impacts the quality of the training stimulus in terms of how much they can lift and for how long, right? Because it'll impact volume over the course of that workout as well as that week, and then certainly impacts recovery, right? And that's really where, if you're looking at where the muscle truly gets bigger and stronger, it's during the repair process. Right. So we provide the stimulus. Now we need to allow for adaptation. And so it's that refeeding and refueling to facilitate that adaptation that now allows you to turn around and do this again tomorrow or the next day. And so really with balancing that, I think that's where it becomes super critical. And again, there are group where it's particularly important to hit these thresholds for daily protein intake. I look at it as, if that's the case and you need to take in, especially if you're somebody bigger, and you've got to hit those protein needs throughout a day. To me, the around training time is just an optimal time to help do that, right? Like, why skip out on that time period? Because you probably need it. Like, you're probably going to need to fit in a meal somewhere around there from a feeding standpoint. So why not take advantage of the stimulus itself to get even more out of that feeding pattern? So I think for them, and again, part of it is going to depend on how long their workout lasts. I would say if your training session is roughly an hour, what you take in during probably doesn't matter a whole lot. It's not going to be a big limiting factor. What you did before, especially like an hour before, and what you do after is going to play a bigger aspect there. And really is now, again, though, if it's somebody who trains early in the morning and they didn't really eat breakfast before they hit the gym, actually eating during can be useful, right? With like, a carbohydrate supplement or something like that, it can get you through that workout. And maybe even a carbohydrate mixed with like essential amino acids. It's easy to consume. Versus trying to drink like whey protein while you're lifting, the more water-based stuff gets a little bit easier. But in that case, it may be more important for them. But otherwise, if you've eaten enough times throughout the day and you're not in a depleted state going into the gym, really what you do during is going to be a little less important. I would say if you have some of the individuals that are also doing aerobic exercise along with this, right? Or if they're doing like high intensity interval training, or they're doing like high intensity functional training, CrossFit type workouts and things like that, some fueling during the intensity of those may be very useful. But again, even with HIFT or CrossFit, those don't tend to be like, multi-hour workouts. Those tend to be a bit shorter. So what you do during is going to be highly dependent on what you did before. If you did enough before, don't worry about the during, just go to the after at this point. But it's not like it's going to hurt you to do something during. You probably just don't need it very much.
Yeah. Yeah. But of course, if we're going to talk about concurrent training, and that is, within one day, somebody might do sort of an aerobic endurance focused session, and later in the day, they may do more strength and power session. And that would apply. I mean, the amateur sports, whether it's, martial arts, I'm thinking everything from jiu-jitsu to amateur triathletes, there's an awful lot of people who are doing concurrent training.
You are exactly right.
This stuff is going to be very relevant to them, right?
Yep. Absolutely. And I would, even beyond that, even with some of your team sport athletes, right? Because it's funny, like with soccer or football, depending how you want to look at it. The thing for us is
football. You guys just claim football. Come on.
I'm actually fine with calling it football. I'm part of the Football Science Institute, so it all works. But again, I played soccer, so whatever. But I think that the reality there is they also have to concurrently train, right? Because we need them to lift, but you can't not have them do endurance exercise. So some sports, it's kind of funny. It's like powerlifting and bodybuilding are the only things that we seem to like, where concurrent training is like a luxury, right? Where it's like, oh, you don't necessarily have to do that. But almost any other actual sport, like, bodybuilding as a sport is pretty debatable, and by the way, before anybody gets really butthurt about this, my wife was an IFBB pro, and she'll be the first to tell you that it's not a sport, because it would be the only thing where you're at your worst on the day of needing to be your best. But it's funny. But the point is, but it's funny because the reality when we look at that though is how you include that concurrent training. And here's the thing: the one thing we know above all else is, even if you just want to get as big and freaky as possible, the reality is there is a positive health benefit to doing aerobic exercise, right? And it's not going to cut into your gains nearly as much as you think it is. And honestly, it's very easy to offset nutritionally. It really is. Like from a little extra protein intake, taking some carbohydrate to replenish so you still get a good weight training workout, you're good. It's really not as big of a deal as everybody, I guess, thought it was. And to be fair, early in my career, based on what we knew about concurrent training, I thought it was a big problem too. Like this is really going to cut into your progress and your gains. If you do it right, it doesn't have to, right? And now I think the more we know nutritionally, the more we realize that you can offset a lot of that. And to be honest, it can actually help with some of the other things because of what you do to increase your overall capacity and mitochondrial function. That can help with recovery between sets too.
Yeah. And that's why I love nutrition, because it can really make a difference. It's still going to come back to the importance of the exercise stimulus, blah, blah, blah. But definitely can make a difference. All right. So look, the final piece of that is endurance performance. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on nutrient timing for endurance performance?
So a lot of it's going to depend on how long that training session is, right? So if you look at somebody who is like an Olympic level marathoner, professional marathon runner, they may be doing in excess of 100 miles a week. And so those are some long sessions. And with that, the timing in that in particular to continue to fuel during it becomes very, very critical. But I think the other part for them that we need to be a little bit more cognizant of is they're also highly in need of protein intake, right? Because that's where the replenishment and recovery and regeneration of functional muscle capability really starts to evolve as well. So don't skip the protein because you're a runner or a cyclist just thinking all you need is carbohydrate. No, you still need the protein as well. And actually your post-workout with that and throughout the rest of the day is going to be very important. And I would say they're probably a group in particular based on their training needs and typical timing of food intake where they may be particularly benefit from a nighttime feeding right before they go to bed of a higher protein bolus, right, in the form of casein or other protein sources, because that can kind of top them off for the day where they might not have had that opportunity with their longer training sessions. And again, even with the triathlete I work with, I mean, you're talking, depending on how they couple their training with, it could be a swim day and a run day. It could be a run and a bike day. Put all these things together. We still had lifting days. The ability to fuel during that workout and especially get right on the recovery as they're putting in 5, 6, 7 days of training in a row, that what you do right after that workout becomes incredibly important. And again, depending on when that last workout was and when your next one is, what you have as a pre-meal is important too. But I would say where with the endurance training, because those sessions tend to be a little bit longer, they won't all be, you won't all have all long sessions. But I would say that making sure that you are taking in foods, your pre-workout foods that are palatable, but also easily digestible. So you're not creating any gut distress during the run or the bike becomes really important. So playing around with those foods to figure out what works for you is also key. And then trying to do as much as you can to mimic that for race days and try to get some of those, especially like if you typically have like your longer training days on the weekend or something like that, especially for like the amateur athletes and it's when they're not working so they can actually get their long run in or something like that. Trying to make that as much like your race day as possible can be very useful so that you do start training the entirety of that response so you know how you're going to handle it on that given day.
Fantastic. I mean, look, it's amazing how we can, it's just 2 words, nutrient timing. And we've spent well over an hour already exploring this topic. Listen, we're kind of out of time here. I'm going to link to the various papers that I read before this chat. We'll have all sorts of stuff in the resources in this video and in this audio podcast. But just to leave the audience with sort of the key takeaways, this concept of nutrient timing, what do you want to leave them with?
I would say, when you look at time of day, whether we're talking pre-workout, inter-workout, post-workout, nighttime, whatever, it all matters. What changes is how much it matters, right? So for some individuals, it may be far more relevant and influential on their recovery and their training and their health than it will be for others. But I think we need to get away from this notion of timing doesn't matter. No, it matters. It's just an issue of degree, right? And if you're looking at a relatively untrained population, it probably doesn't matter much because the training and the overall food intake is going to matter way more. If you're working with an athlete or working with somebody who's an aspiring athlete or somebody who wants to be athletic, right? Timing starts to actually make a bigger difference. And it's all in how you manipulate it. But I think the other thing I want everybody to realize that we touched on right up front that I think we've done, I like to think we've done a pretty good job throughout this whole podcast of doing is reiterating that when we're talking about nutrient timing, we are not just talking about protein timing, right? It is nutrient timing. That includes your carbohydrates. That includes your protein. I mean, we, like you said before, even from a supplement standpoint, nitrate ingestion, right? If we're talking beetroot, 2.5 hours before you want it to peak in your system. If you're talking about sodium bicarbonate, right? Are we using a sort of a multi-day approach? Or are we going to do a single bolus? Or are we going to do that, 3 to 4 hours pre, so we get peaks there? Caffeine timing, right? So now it's going to be one of those things that if it peaks at about 60 minutes, how long is your event going to last? Or are you going to need to top off again? So all of those things also fit under the timing umbrella. And those are all nutrients as well. So I would encourage people to take a little bit of a broader approach to what we talk about with nutrient timing. Don't just think of it as an isolated macronutrient, because it's just one part of it. And even if you only think about that one, right? And I love protein, so that's fine. I get it. But don't just think about what it means for hypertrophy, because protein influences the immune response. Protein influences adaptation. Protein influences enzymes, right? Protein influences neurotransmitters. So hormones. So when we start to look at all those things, take a bigger, but at the same time, more pragmatic approach of it. There's not really a scenario where not refueling is the best solution. Right. So, it makes sense from that standpoint, and it's really not that hard to do.
Professor Shawn Arent, thank you for joining me on Fueling Greatness. I knew we were going to have a good chat. We knew it. But it's the passion that comes through that I love particularly. Thank you. It matters to you, and it matters to your work and your research. But this stuff really will matter to people that actually try this stuff. So, we've talked about it, and people will get a lot from this conversation. And I'm looking forward to getting you back, Shawn, at some point. There's so many other things we could talk about. But there are. But thank you for your time. It's been great.
Thank you. And I appreciate you having me on. I love that you're launching this new podcast, and the fact that you wanted me on early is honestly, Laurent, incredibly flattering. But I always enjoy these conversations. And I just want to say on behalf of the listening audience as well, I appreciate what you bring to this space, because it's useful, it's practical, and it's science-based. And I love that, but I think you're able to help put it into terms that people can grasp rather than just something that comes out of a journal article, right? So, thank you for what you bring to the field as well. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for saying that. I'm trying hard. And it's easier when I have experts like yourself to talk to. So that's been great. Okay, wonderful. Take care, and thank you so much.
Take it easy.